Hi everyone, and welcome to this session, Mix and Match, comparing motives and means for measuring social outcomes. Thanks for joining us for this session today, and we'll be exploring the why and how of measuring social outcomes. In particular, we'll be considering how we might need to rethink traditional approaches to measurement and accountability to enable more collaborative approaches to tackling complex social issues. It's brilliant to see so many people joining us, and I think a few more people will join us, but we're going to kick off on time. So my name's Dawn Plymmer. I work for Collaborate CIC, a social enterprise that supports thinking, culture and practice of collaboration. And I'll be facilitating today's session along with colleagues from GoLab. So maybe GoLab colleagues, if you give a wave. So we've got Nigel Ball, Joe Blundell, Claire Fitzgerald, and Lee Crowley, who's keeping all the tech and everyone on track with joining in IT issues. So I'm just going to give a few introductions and context to today, set out the structure, and then I'll be handing over to a great lineup of speakers. We've got 6 great speakers who will kick off today's conversation, and then we'll have plenty of time for Q&A, so you'll all have the chance to dive into the conversation, ask any questions, contribute your thoughts. So to start with, I just wanted to give a little bit of context for why Collaborate, why GoLab are interested in this topic about motives and means for measuring social outcomes. Joe Blundell in a moment is going to talk about some work that GoLab has done, but I think as 2 organisations, we're really interested in how we do measure differently in complex contexts. At Collaborate, we particularly support place-based collaboration, and often we see these efforts kind of hit up against challenges with traditional approaches to governance and accountability. So often these approaches are based on linear views of how change happens. They focus on the role of single organisations. They attempt to prove and kind of attribute impact to these single organisations. And there's a big focus on measurement in terms of kind of upwards accountability. So reporting to governance structures that perhaps don't reflect the realities and the priorities of the people that we're ultimately trying to serve. So in our work at Collaborate, we often see this tension, so that the mindset, the structures that not only don't incentivise collaboration, but sometimes actually actively discourage it. So we're really passionate about trying to find new ways of understanding how we can work better together in complex contexts and how we learn together to constantly improve, while also recognising that there's obviously really important drivers around demonstrating value, around effectiveness, around value for money. So just to give a little bit of a flavour of the work that Collaborate's been up to in this space the past few years, we've been working with Newcastle Business School, and great to have Rob from the Business School here today. So we've been looking at what it takes to work and fund effectively in complex environments. And in the new approaches that we've seen, measurement still remains important, but for the purpose of improving, not so much proving. There's a real focus on measurement for learning, so enabling adaptation, ongoing improvement, quite an experimental approach. And I think one of the most interesting bits is a focus on kind of accountability for learning, not accountability for predefined targets, predefined results. GoLab, explores similar themes in rallying together. Joe will tell us a little bit more about that in a second. So Collaborate and GoLab have really come together around this shared interest that has really come up from practical research on the ground. And also we held a roundtable together in April, just as COVID started to hit, which really kind of emphasised the importance of the issues of adaptive practice, really understanding complexity and what that means for the way we work more than ever. So following on from that roundtable that Joe will talk more about, we are planning to hold a series of kind of really practice-focused peer learning sessions over the coming months. We'll explain more about this later, but a kind of open invitation to everyone. If you would like to continue today's conversation, if you would like to dive into more practical examples, there will be the opportunity to engage in some sessions which will start next month. So just to kind of give you a flavour of who you'll be able to hear from today. So we've got some brilliant practical and international examples to hear from. In a moment, as I've said, we'll hear from Joe Blundell from GoLab, and also a Collaborate associate, on the Rallying Together report that she co-authored, and also some of the key insights from that roundtable that I mentioned. And then I'll hand over to our speakers, who will each give a 5-minute introduction, before Nigel will pick up and share the Q&A. So just to give you a sense of who you'll be, it's right in front of me. So yeah, we'll be hearing from Rob, from John, from Carolina, Lavinia, and from Tim, who will each share a little bit of their work, just to kind of prompt some thinking from you all and provoke some questions and conversations, which will take up the bulk of the discussion today. So the final thing that I would just want to say is please participate actively in the conversation. So engage in the Q&A, and also feel free to post questions and engage in the chat throughout. Nigel will be picking up on all of those comments, and do raise your hand if you'd like to come in at any point during the Q&A. That's everything from me, and so I'm going to hand over to Joe, who's going to kick us off with some provocations.
Thanks, Dawn, very much, and good to see everybody this morning. So what I wanted to do mainly today is just tell you a little bit about what GoLab had been doing, which has led us to an interest in this subject, and then to talk. What I'm going to focus on in my 5 minutes of fame is just really what we found in the round table, which was a really rich bringing together of people that have an interest in this. And I think what we'd like to share is what we took from that round table and what we're now testing out as a kind of how we've interpreted some of the challenges around that, and perhaps some of the way through the challenges that we saw. So the background from GoLab's point of view is that we did some work which we published in a report called Rallying Together, or I'll Be Rallying Together, which looked at how authorities or places were collaborating. And we found from that a number of common challenges, the principal of which was finding ways in which success was defined and measured. And people really on each occasion, no matter how mature other aspects of their collaboration were, found still that this question of how to define measurement and accountability and learning to be particularly tricky. Since then, we've been working with one authority in Essex for the last year, in helping them going through a journey of stitching together a multi-sector county-wide partnership, looking particularly at how they determine this question of accountability, learning and success for themselves, and really finding very much for ourselves that this is quite a tricky issue, but nevertheless sort of trying to find our way through it. But what I want to do in the next 2-3 minutes is just share the learning that we took, particularly from the last roundtable that we had, and we hope, based on it's my job now to sell the richness of the debate, I guess, through the feedback. But we hope you participate, because I think we're getting some really useful things out of those discussions. So from that roundtable, we tried to distill 7 principles of what we found were common across what felt initially like quite a divisive debate. You had camps in the room that felt that, you know, some of the old traditional KPI and target-based ways of working, were now, you know, a very old hat and created an completely inappropriate dynamic, and through to those that felt that a more balanced, that accountability and having some sort of expectation of success and accountability of what was achieved was nevertheless still very important. But actually what we found in the debate, inevitably, actually was a lot more common ground, and we all shared the problem, but we're all still grappling with the potential solution. So to tell you about the 7 principles, we won't have time to debate them now, but I'd love to be able to pick up as we go through the debate what you think of those, and any comments perhaps in the chat function or the Q&A afterwards to help us refine them would be very welcome. So what we started with is the first principle was start with a systems perspective, which really meant broadening your individual and collective lens to uncover the multiple factors and actors to understand and address the issue. And really this is around not really coming from an individual or an organizational perspective, but looking really at the underlying case for change, and understand, and also putting yourself in the shoes and understanding the perspective of others. The second one was building a shared purpose, and focusing on purpose, we thought, was a useful way through this question of, do we need targets, or actually do we need a sense of collective endeavour and shared goals on which you build trusting relationships? And that, we felt, probably if you had to prioritise this, would be one of the most important principles. The third was focusing on enabling informed judgments. So really working to make sure that feedback and learning builds the expertise of everyone, including funders, practitioners themselves, service users and citizens. So actually enabling, using knowledge, feedback and data to make everyone better informed, so they make better personal decisions and can be better accountable for those decisions. The fourth was develop legitimate measures, which is really around how we gather information and acknowledge that organisations and people from different backgrounds hold different values and different perspectives on what success means, and how you actually bring those different perspectives around a set of a common understanding that can combine collaborations together. Review goals, so not take goals or the changing of goals as an admission of failure, that the goals weren't right, but expect to change goals. Having that flexibility is actually a way in which the system learns and adapts and is still relevant. Take a context-led approach. So develop an approach to accountability that recognises how complex a context is and how possible, where it's possible and useful in terms of measurement. And we're going to hear right at the end of this conference from Professor Al-Noor Ibrahim, and we were very highly influenced by his work, that actually there's not a one-size-fits-all, which would no surprise to anyone, but there is a way of perhaps coding about deciding how you decide, and important to build the consensus around how you make decisions and how you bring context into the way you design systems of learning, measurement and accountability. And the last one was take a nuanced approach to evidence. So we felt there was rarely a situation where we know all the answers and where we have no existing insight, but rather than be completely led by evidence-led practice, you need that narrative around what you're finding on the ground. And actually, rather than competing from those perspectives, you try to bring them together and reconcile them as you go going on, recognizing the need for flexibility and adaptation. So those are our 7 principles. I'm going to post on the chat function a link to the blog, which has those in if you like to read them in your own time. But I'll leave it there, and hopefully we'll get to pick some of those up as we go through the discussion today.
Brilliant, thank you, Jo. Lots of useful food for thought there. And yeah, feel free to post any comments in the chat, take a look at the blog that we've just posted, and to pick up on those themes throughout the discussion today. And so following on from Jo's contribution, I'd like to hand over to the speakers now. So we'll hear from our 5 speakers for 5 minutes each. Do note down or post in the chat any questions that pop up, and then we'll open up to a Q&A afterwards. So if each speaker could give a short introduction to your work and also try to address the specific question that we'll pose to you. So first, we're coming to Rob Wilson from Northumbria University. And Rob, the question that we're posing to you today is, your work presents a way to think about measurement as action for contextual collaborative improvement, quite a mouthful. So our question for you today is, what do you mean by this? Could you dig into that a bit more and tell us what you mean?
Well, I can try, can't I? Can everyone hear me? Okay, I'll assume everyone can hear me. Today we've got not the Andy Warhol 15 minutes, we've got 5 minutes of fame, so I'll try and be as quick as I can. So my interests, this thinking, which my original paper was called Time to Change the Rules of the Game, Breaking the Link Between Data and Outcomes. So my background is an information systems academic. So my interest is coming at this from 2 parts. Work I've done with Toby Lowe and other colleagues at Northumbria, which led to sort of ideas that outcome-based performance management led organizations rationally and perhaps inevitably to ideas of gamesmanship as a response to the system. So things we're familiar with, creaming, parking, and so on. But also coming at it from an information systems perspective, looking at the nexus of what in that world is called socio-technical relationships, in which a social impact bond, for instance, or any other policy, social or service innovation can be understood. So, you know, if what you might call the iron cage of bureaucracy, you know, things like NHS tariff payments, which shape what's possible in an environment. So the performance of public services over the last 30 or 40 years has been based on this principle that we can use measurement to specify contracts, make judgments, talk about quality of services, and that these services can be held accountable or sorted according to such an approach. And this is what in the literature is often can be termed as metrological realism, or what some people have called the view from nowhere. So the idea, this is sort of taking the scientific method where issues such as sampling, measurement, error, precision, lack of bias are foregrounded in order to create sort of truths about how things should be. And this idea of metrological realism dominates our understanding of transactions and economic activity, but also the way we talk about products and quality, what Porter calls trust in numbers. And the epistemology, if you like, is and what counts as knowledge in the system is a given. So, you know, and how to produce that knowledge. So this then means that, you know, what gets measured gets done. And, you know, it's not surprising perhaps that, you know, in the last sort of term that governments adopted a lot of this sort of thinking to account for policy, success of policy and the relationships to the quality of services. Now, this contrasts with a set of different sort of approach, which in the literature is called conventional realism. So the idea is that prior to this industrialization of measurement, the dominant approach was the negotiation of conventions and the social construction of phenomena. And it meant that in meaningful terms, in a pre-industrial society, an acre was an acre, a bushel was a bushel, and so on around here. So in different places, different localities or different marketplaces have different accounts of what counted as a measurement. So what we have termed this in some of our work as a view from somewhere, and then knowledge and information and measurement was interpreted in the context of social relationships and local convention. So if we then think about this in the context of a delivery of a SIB and the wider service environment, the work still goes on despite the performance and accountability regime of the contact and targets, etc. And in reality, the targets are negotiated and workarounds are put in place to manage them. And one interpretation of this is that there's an underground or invisible mensuration process going on. And I'll explain what mensuration is next. So mensuration is the practices of local measurement reached through negotiation and social construction, rather like some of the things Joe was talking about doing in Essex just now. And that governability is achieved through this local governance, negotiation, this trust in relationships to establish measures and values of the somewhere. And this has the potential to have to improve social functions of a place in terms of improved inclusion. It can improve the economic functions, so resources can be better negotiated and better placed, and it taps into a set of cultural and historical sort of functions, an idea of identity and agency. So when I talk about trying to change the rules of the game, I'm talking for the potential for an approach that adopts explicitly a more mensurative method through this idea of collaborative improvement. So conventions that promote collaborations and negotiations. Learning is important, but it is learning in action. It's learning by doing, it's learning in place. But also there's this need to build these socio-technical infrastructures that support this activity. Data is not collected to evaluate outcomes in the normative metrological realist sense. It's very much more negotiated. And then, as again, reflecting some of the things Joe said, it's the key role of civic engagement, organizations, communities and individuals in interpretive communities to create a broader base of data, both quant and qual, in order to deliberate and govern these conventions. So there are two social outcomes here, at least: better service environment and also an improved local governance environment. So that's all I wanted to say. Hopefully that wasn't 5 minutes, it was more like 20, but never mind.
No, I think you kept your time pretty well. Thank you, Rob. I really like that distinction you drew between a view from nowhere to a view from somewhere. I think that's a really useful framing for us to think about today, how we do take that more contextual perspective, how we do value social relationships as part of that. So next, I think will be an opportunity to pick up on a few of the themes that Rob raised there. I'm going to hand over to John Burgoyne from the Centre for Public Impact. And John is going to talk a little bit about what measurement for learning looks like in practice, and he's also going to dive into a practical example of what that looks like. Over to you, John.
Thank you so much. Great to be here. Hey everyone, quick introduction. My name is John Burgoyne. I'm from the Center for Public Impact, or CPI. Our purpose is to reimagine government so that it works better for everyone. And I want to get quickly into a practical example that really builds on a lot of the themes that we were talking about today. But first, just in terms of a little bit of context for this work and how it came about, at CPI, we were very fortunate to be part of the Upstream Collaborative, which is an active learning network that is supported by Nesta and also led by great work of Collaborate. And so we have been working with 9 local authorities as part of a working group that's focused on meaningful measurement, trying to help develop a different approach to measurement that is focused more on learning and improvement as opposed to control and accountability. So to start, I was supposed to say this completely builds off all of the great work that people have already talked about today. Collaborates work with Toby Lowe on commission complexity, Go Labs on rallying together, and a bunch of others that we're super grateful to provide inspiration in terms of thinking about how to do measurement differently. And so one of the examples that came out of that I wanted to talk about comes from Oxford City Council, so relatively close for where some people are now. And it's an example that I want to talk about because, one, it's something that is not this grand, different approach that feels so difficult and impossible to actually try. It's something that we do feel coming out of this conference, even people could try to trial within their own teams. And 2 is that people may not necessarily traditionally even think of it as measurement or evaluation. It's something that when you naturally your mind goes to what measurement looks like, this is not what it is. It's much more a reflective practice that enables learning that we think is a great direction to go in. So what the approach is an idea from Chris Bolton out of the Wales Audit Office called Learning Pods, which we put to practice and trialed in Oxford City Council. Very simple approach where you bring together a team of people within the local authority who don't necessarily work together, but is overrepresented with staff who are directly working with residents in the community. And we did this via Zoom, where you set a little bit of context up front for about 30 local government staff. And also we had a nonprofit, Oxford Hub, who was joining as well, who've been working with the council. And we broke everyone into Zoom breakout groups and just asked them to go through a set of simple reflection questions. What have you done differently over the past month? What did you learn? What enabled that learning? And what has gone wrong? And the important piece here is that this is a safe space where people feel like they can actually open up and share about what they're learning over the past week. And it enables different types of more generative insights into not only what we learned, but how can we change and improve moving forward. So key to the success of the learning pods was after having those sessions, we did a full group discussion where people did a readout. And joining that readout was leadership, who was committed to coming with an open mind, open mind, and most importantly, ensuring that the actions recommended would be acted upon in the future. And a few of the things that we learned coming out of there, out of the reflections that everyone took part of, were one, that relationships and trust built over time across teams and organizations pay dividends. 2, information flow across the council and between organizations is a challenge that we need to continue focusing on in the future. 3 is that it's really important for the council to be as accessible as possible, especially for minority groups, to be able to understand and access services, and also to feel the council is somewhere they could work to be more representative. And lastly, it is really possible to be flexible and nimble in responding to the needs of citizens, and that's something that we want to take forward. So these were some of the high-level insights from which kind of recommendations about how they could adapt in the future were taken forward. And this is all part of the approach that the council worked on, drawing inspiration from others, called measurement for learning, which Dawn talked about at the top, really, and Joe built on it as well. But it's really about shifting the purpose of measurement away from that top-down accountability and control, but towards learning and improvement. So really excited to hear other people's thoughts on what that looks like in practice and the challenges that it takes to actually doing it on a bigger scale within local authorities, but also different levels of government as well.
Thank you, John. Really helpful to hear that practical example, and particularly that process that you went through. And yeah, I'll be really interested to explore later that point you made about exploring what went wrong as well as went right, and how we learn from failure, and how we're honest and open in those learning spaces we create. So yeah, keen to pick up on that later. Next, we'll be hearing from Karolina Osterchuk from the University of Warsaw. Karolina has been doing ethnographic work with collaborative social innovation projects in Warsaw. As part of this, she's identified that trust-based funding is a really important enabler of the work. So Karolina, my question to you is, so what does trust-based funding look like, and what does it mean for measurement?
Hello. Thank you for introducing me. Yeah. So again, I'm Karolina and I come from the University of Warsaw. And I'd like to share with you the results of my ethnographic work, which was based on 3 case studies. The cases were selected, like all of them are bottom-up initiatives located in one area of Warsaw. They have some significant community gather and are recognized as successful and meaningful by the public and by various partners. So what I learned from one of my interviewees, the leader of Open Settlement Initiative, is that sometimes the criteria of a project evaluation are so time-consuming and distant from their real work that they avoid these standards. Instead, they choose relations based on trust and mutual respect. And today I'd like to briefly explain what is the meaning of trust for social innovation initiatives that I have studied, and what kind of outcomes are possible to achieve with trust-based funding. So trust-based funding, so you asked me to explain. So it is a model in which the grants are unrestricted, and non-profits have the flexibility to allocate the funds where they are needed most at the moment, and where the funds can make a real difference. Such approach allows non-profits to think more expansively about their activities and build an integrated strategy instead of achieving different goals of different partnerships. And taking an example from my research that I have mentioned before, the interviewer explained me that when they were involved in trust-based relations, the founder relied on the positive effects of their previous projects and potential of the applying group, and gave them the freedom to spend the funds according to the needs of the project. Against the other funds, it allowed them, for example, to pay the salaries when they had financial problems, and it ensured the continuity of the work. And so my idea here is that organizations know better the field of work and they should be trusted in it. As social workers who are involved in everyday life of the community they support, they have better information and more professional expertise than government does. The focus is on learning from the projects instead of sticking to proposal outcomes that may be outdated. In trust-based funding, both sides collaborate rather as partners who share the goals of performance and program management, and the information is exchanged on a regular basis instead of reporting from time to time, periodically. And so the problem of outdated proposal is very true for social innovation initiatives, which are not able and are not even willing to describe the final outcomes of the project before it is begun. It is because they often develop projects through the method of in vivo experiments, which allows them to achieve more innovative results, as well leave space to better adapt to the local context. Just quickly, by definition, social innovation is described as innovative social relations, means new ways of doing, organizing, and framing things. So the initiatives experiment in order to offer a new value, or to satisfy the unsatisfied need, or to bring a solution to some emerging problem. Like, for example, one of my cases. The initiative is representing the voice of the residents and non-profits inhabiting a neighborhood in a discussion with the local authorities. They try to work out a new form of managing a public space, which will give more independence to those who live and work there when it comes to decision-making, planning, etc. And this is very active neighborhood, and the pace of the transformation which is happening there is more dynamic than the official procedures can manage. And moreover, following all the rules make the initiative lose a lot of time, resources, and opportunities. And currently, this intersectoral collaboration looks more like a battle. However, it is a process, a long-term process. So during my interviews, I have found out that social innovation model is probably never final. It is always in the process of creation. And such approach can work very well for two reasons. Initiatives committed to problem solving cope very well with crisis. It was visible during the pandemic. Second, they can work out a solution which is sustainable and adapts over and over to changing environment. However, as I said, at the same time, it means that the innovators, they do not know at the beginning what exactly will be the result of the work. It depends on many factors. For example, on the dynamics of the community, how big it grows, what resources will be brought into it by new members, or what they will learn in the meantime. And this type of work is very context dependent. The initiatives must study the local environment and not just a solution to local community. It is a dynamic process of interactions between the project and the environment, and such dynamics make again the results quite unpredictable. Moreover, social innovation needs to have its own community, or I call them believers, who keep the knowledge and actively practice the innovation. Building a community and creating the knowledge within it is often an underestimated outcome. For example, food cooperative that I have studied is very dedicated to creating and spreading the knowledge about food security. When I asked them to tell me step by step how their initiative was created, the person explained me that first the initiative had gathered the people, and only after they had this core community, they started developing together the model of a cooperative, which will be most suitable for its members. And nowadays, they are creating knowledge on many other topics related to food security. For example, how to ensure food supplies for citizens during the crisis. But we can look at this from a broader perspective, because what they also do is they create some kind of new narratives which are needed to transform social awareness before transforming their practice. So yeah, so maybe I can quickly summarize if I still have some time. So just why the trust in funding is important for the results of funded projects. So flexible requirements regarding the outcomes stimulate creativity and innovativeness. The outcomes described in the proposal might be outdated after the project is developed. The innovation is a result of the process of experimenting, and it is sometimes worth to risk for it. Trust-based funding encourages this risk-taking, exploration of new ideas and creativity. means the elements which are needed to produce innovation. And building a community around the social issue is a valuable outcome, as well creating new narratives. And finally, trust in the relation is changing power dynamics, and it is empowering to think and act outside the box. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you, Carolina. You've covered so much there based on those case studies that you've done. I really like what you said about the opportunity to kind of get beyond that project mindset, think more expansively, and all those opportunities of trust-based funding that you mentioned, including that kind of building that community, the value of the process of engagement, as well as the measurement and evaluation itself. So thank you for that. And there's so much more that I'm sure we'll dig into in the Q&A in a moment.
Great, thank you very much.
Thank you. Next, we're going to hear from Lavinia Pastor from the University of Rome. Lavinia has been looking at the readiness of organisations to use data for decision making, a theme that we've already heard a little bit about today. So Lavinia, our question to you is, what are the signs of effective practice?
Thank you very much, and hello to everybody. Yes, I'm Lavinia Pastore. I'm a researcher at the University of Rome, Tor Vergata, and I'm a founder of an innovative startup and research spin-off called Open Impact. Just very quickly, the context on which we are experimenting this kind of analysis. We are working in Italy with a local government of a Umbria region, that is a region in the center of Italy. We are working as university and as spin-off with this region, with the School of Government. They have created a school of social innovation, and they are experimenting and trying to build the ecosystem that you were talking about, in which you can shift to outcome-based contracts. So we are actually trying to work with them in a broader sense and to understand what do we need to build this kind of ecosystem. And so one of the first questions was related to the state of art of social enterprises in that area. So we came up with an assessment that is basically composed by two main synthetic indicators. And one of it is related to data management. So we investigated how social enterprises are collecting data, how do they use data, and also there was a focus on data on social impact or outcome measurement. But first of all, we wanted to understand the managerial culture of social enterprises in that territory related to the overall discourse of data, that I think is quite coherent also with the Hack and Learn that I've been following, organized by GoLab during these days, because we were asking ourselves, so how is difficult for a social enterprise that is actually operating in a territory and delivering services also to managing data? So through this index, we, first of all, the assessment was composed by one index related to data management, let's say, and the other one to economic sustainability, and their perception also on being able to go on with investments, and their perception about risks for the future related to their economic sustainability. So we did this assessment on 250 social enterprises in the area. And now we have the first result. I want to say that this kind of research that we are carrying on with the local government is going to be a 3-year program. This is why we are trying to build the ecosystem to shift to outcome contracts for the welfare services. And this is one of the many actions that we are trying to put in. So then the second year is starting now, and we are going also to work on outcome areas related to services, new welfare services, for instance. So, and this assessment, we are going to repeat it for 3 years, because you have to think that it's a snapshot. So of course, it's very interesting, the results, but you have also to see how they might change during time. The main findings is that we divided the social enterprises into 4 clusters. The first cluster is where we find the most ready social enterprises. That is actually the more consistent part of the sample. The 38% of the sample is there. So it's not, it's a good news, let's say. And so now we know that, for instance, the first policy for instance, instituting an outcome fund might be directed to this kind of social enterprises that are a portion of it. Most of the other enterprises are in other clusters in which they might not have a good index on data management or economic sustainability perspective. And it is very interesting that the situation is polarized. So the most significant cluster is the one in which the social enterprises are ready, the 38%, but the other one is the 31%. So enterprises that they declare that they are not actually collecting data, or they are doing it, but mainly on papers. So with a series of problems if we want to shift to outcome-based contracts, for instance, and they don't have a vision of an economic sustainability in the next 3 years. So, and if you think the situation is very different, you have also to think that we investigated what, from a statistical point of view, are not-for-profit institutions in Italy. So there, of course, you find organizations that are properly, let's say, social enterprises. And then, of course, you find also charity organizations, for instance, that are very good in data management, but that they have a different structure of economic sustainability. And so they might be interesting in other kind of contracts or projects. So we have to differentiate. For instance, in the first cluster, the one of the ready organization, we find social enterprises working with the healthcare system, working in local economic development, and working in culture and sports activities. These are the main sectors. And we find organizations that have revenues above 1 million per year. So pretty big organizations if we talk about this kind of environment. And of course, in the same sample, we find smaller organizations, voluntary organizations that might have very low revenues because it is not their mission, okay? It's a very different kind of organization. So those are the main findings. Then we will go on with the project. And of course, we will use these kind of findings to work with the School of Government and to see how can we structure future policies that are based on outcomes. We did, of course, meetings with the social enterprise in which we explained the assessments and then the results. And now we are doing an in-depth assessments with the organizations that are in cluster 1. So the organizations that are most ready. Now we are going in deep end to see which are their features, if they have actually data on outcomes. So aside from the data management within the organization, how are they ready exactly relating the topic to outcome? So this is a very quick, I hope I stayed in time.
Great, thank you, Lavinia. Really interesting insight into the readiness of different types of social enterprise, and I'm sure later we'll be able to explore a little bit more kind of what outcomes-based contracts you're talking about and how that aligns with some of the perspectives that the other speakers have been sharing as well. So thank you. And we're now going to move on to our final speaker, Tim Reddall from the University of Queensland. And Tim has quite a big question to tackle. He set this himself. In an age of increasingly wicked problems, how can policymakers address some of the limitations around measuring social outcomes? Over to you, Tim.
Great, thanks everyone, and thanks for the opportunity from Australia to be here today. I'm going to share some work that my colleague Sarah Ball and I have been working on in different contexts here in Australia on policy impact and how we think about the term policy success as part of thinking about outcomes. And I suppose focusing on social outcomes prioritises, unsurprisingly, finding a problem and solving it. However, in the time of, as the question proposes, of increasingly interconnected, wicked and complex policy contexts, defining the problems themselves, let alone finding meaningful solutions is becoming increasingly difficult, if not a problem in itself. So we're in this context of reflecting on broader policy thinking, thinking about some of the many themes we've just talked about already in terms of the different experiences and policy and research questions people have been looking at. And what we want to look at is some two particular case studies that Sarah and I have been working on separately, but coming together, thinking about how they might have some common issues that we can share and think about. And I'll talk about those in a moment. But I might just go to the, there's increasingly, I suppose, within the Australian context, our federation, our different levels of government, national, state, local government, as well as civil society and market-based actors are creating challenges for how we think about policy cohesion in defining problems and defining outcomes and delivering solutions and measuring success. So, and there's increasing pressure on delivery, but what is the outcome to be achieved and what's the pathway to success? And how do we think about the sort of complexity around policy, politics, and program-based thinking? And we'll talk about that a little bit in a moment. Might just go to the next slide. And I think how we just try to think about how we often think about policy thinking through the policy cycle as it's popularised here in Australia. It's not, and it's a common way of thinking about the policy process from identifying issues, through to evaluation. And I suppose to be fair, it's really a mind map, the policy cycle, that enables us to think about the various stages of policy making. However, it's not a representation of reality. Real processes are more dynamic, with many unforeseen detours and deviations. And the outcome-based policy thinking represented there with the design squiggle, if you like, talks about that iterative nature of policy making, moving from understanding the problem or challenge and how you iterate that through to prototypes and then back again, and how you bring that virtual process together. It's complex, it's difficult. And I think there are many ways that we've talked about some of those today of achieving this sort of approach through various strategies. And often they focus on the methods, not understanding that context. So our two case studies that I wanted to just briefly talk about, looking at both a local a social service initiative in the Australian Capital Territory that Sarah led about co-designing a solution to addressing family violence within the ACT, and how you looked at working with the barriers and the facilitation co-design to build an evidence base through that process, and the work I've been looking at more strategically within the Queensland Department of Housing, understanding how we develop and evaluate a housing strategy. Both the case studies talk about evidence-based, collaborative, outcome-focused, and look about how do we build the interplay between the strategic and the operational. And I think understanding that success and achieving our outcomes is a balancing act. Sometimes I often see it as a boxing match between the program success, the politics, and the process. And particularly, increasingly, we talk about collaboration, but often we're drawn to finding a single solution to complex problems very quickly. And I think our two case studies highlight the complexity of both addressing a more localised issue, albeit a very complex social problem around family violence, and then also trying to work strategically to evaluate a major housing strategy initiative within Queensland. It'll inevitably, even though the pressure is on to be demanded to be quick and solve the problem quickly, but inevitably the process is slow. So fidelity and speed become less important than the themes many of my colleagues have been talking about today around quality and trust. But evaluation and measurement, as we've talked about, rarely, if ever, takes into account the process and policy, process and politics. Often that means those issues are hidden or pushed underground. And so including process and politics in measurement and evaluation will help to highlight and minimise concerns about ineffectiveness, inefficiency. Engagement, collaboration and political impact are not only valuable but essential policy design ingredients. So it's about shifting, also about working with stakeholders directly and acting where needed, as I've done in the work I've done, as an internal insider within a government department and a critical friend to progress both strategic actions and more practical issues. So it's about being agile and adaptive, and it's not easy or straightforward. It can be messy and complex and often confusing, as I increasingly have found. And no doubt, as we're all living through the COVID experience, it's both that messiness and complexity, but also I think an opportunity to drive innovation and change. Thank you.
Thanks, Tim. That really nicely summed up a lot of the themes we've heard about today. And I really like your point about that kind of more embedded approach to measurement and evaluation. How do we take into account the process, the politics, and have that more agile and adaptive approach that responds to context and informs the policy development process as well. And so a big thank you to everyone for those contributions and for sticking to time so well. Lots of food for thought there, and it's great to see that there's lots of comments popping up in the chat box, so do keep going with those. I'm going to hand over to Nigel Ball now from GoLab, who's going to chair the Q&A session.
Thank you so much, Dawn, and thanks as well to all of you who have shared your thoughts and your research so far. It's really interesting stuff. I'd really love to hear from some of our audience members. It'd be nice to make this discussion. I know there's lots of other expertise and experiences in the virtual room. I know that because I know some of you, and I'm sure many of you who I don't know also have thoughts to share. So please do raise your hand. You can use the virtual raise hand by clicking on participants at the bottom of your screen, like that. I've just done it. Or you can raise your hand physically if you've got your video on. I should be able to see you. So please do. So Keys, I'll come to you first. Just before I do, Keys, I just wanted to offer one reflection myself just before I go to the room, which is that I think in what we've heard so far, there's been a lot of focus on process and the processes of, I guess, incentivizing collaboration, getting systems to work better, coming around the table to kind of work through the complexity of problems. But I think that still leaves a question about what we measure, if indeed we measure anything. You know, so are we saying that actually we should be focusing on process to the extent that we needn't be measuring, if you like, what the outcome is or what's kind of happening at an abstract level? Or are we saying that we do still need that measurement, but actually it somehow has a role in supporting that process? I guess that's an interesting question for me, which I hope we can explore as we go through the discussion. Keys, I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly. It'd be great to hear your experiences. Please do introduce yourself and let us know your reflections, and indeed question, if you've got a question for any of the panelists, that's great. You're muted at the moment. Are you able to unmute? Oh, that's strange. Okay, let's see if we can get some.
Yeah.
There we go. Great.
Can you hear me now?
Can.
Yeah. Yes, indeed. In English, my name is Kees. In Dutch, I'm from the Netherlands. We say Kees, but it's the same. What's in the name? I'm a professor of corporate finance and governance at the University of Tilburg in the Netherlands. But I've also been with the Boston Consulting Group for 20 years and was a partner there for over 10 years. So I've been working both in the private sector and also in the public sector. Last October, Nigel, you posted a blog which said that despite of having been on the scene for almost 10 years, the social impact bonds remain a niche instrument. And then you ask the question, why the gulf between rhetoric and reality? My question is one of the reasons why the number of SIPs, etc., are quite disappointing in terms of growth and absolute numbers, is one of the reasons all the measurement problems and the lack of trust between parties. It's a question to anybody who would like to like to answer.
Yeah, it's interesting to make the link with social impact bonds and this discussion. I think the rhetoric around social impact bonds supports probably a more, I guess, systematic or objective form of codified learning. Whereas I think a lot of the examples we've been talking about are emphasizing more of a kind of softer or kind of subjective or qualitative learning and talking about the processes that can support that. But interestingly, a lot of social impact bonds do seem to also support some of that more trust-based qualitative learning, despite the fact that they're sort of in this wrapper of a mechanism that's more about kind of the codified quantitative hard measurement. So I think, you know, there's an interesting discussion and potentially a bit of a debate around that. I don't know whether any of our panelists would like to chip in on that one. Rob, you might have an interesting view on that, Rob Wilson.
In terms of the data.
Yeah, just I suppose, well, I know you've got views on sort of the payment by results mechanism and whether that can support or undermine some of the sort of processes and approaches we're talking about here.
Yeah, of course. I mean, I think I've just been typing in the chat. If any of us care to remember as far back as 10 years ago, which was the end of the new Labour administration, they spent something like 12 years investing very heavily in partnership working. And I think it was a potentially, as I say, transformational sort of time in terms of the scale of that investment. But because of the ways in which the data and the performance management was run, it meant that everything was mandated. So you had to achieve the certain targets, you had to, you know, and all that sort of potential for the sort of mentorative approach I was talking about at the start in my presentation, it was lost. And as soon as those things were no longer required, everybody just relaxed and forgot about it. And you know, what we saw was a great sort of hollowing out of the local state in the last 10 years in England at least. And I think that has, if you like, intensified even the way that data is used and linked to outcomes and the way that happens. And performance by results is just a sort of a version of that, a very intense version, but it is merely a version of a wider set of structures and sort of wider set of structures and policy approaches in terms of the way policy is enacted. So, you know, sorry, but yeah, that's my, yeah, I don't sit on the fence when it comes to PBR. Yeah, sorry.
Thanks, Rob.
Could I jump in, Nigel? Tim
Yeah.
here. I want to go back to some of the points I was trying to make about problem. The problem definition often can, this might be an unfair representation of social impact bonds, but become a very narrow, because it's linked to a funding mechanism, and the notion of the outcome is narrowed rather than taking account of some of the complexity I think we've been talking about. I mean, that can also be an excuse for not measuring some of the harder things we want to look at. But that's been some of our experience here in Australia. I think it takes a long time to get things delivered, but also maybe the narrowing of the problem could be an issue too.
Thanks, Tim. I can see there's a comment from Benjamin at Red Quadrant, just responding to some of Rob's comments in the chat. I'm wondering if, because I know you've also got interesting views on this, Benjamin, whether we could hear from you.
Yes, can you hear me? I've had some technical problems this morning, so.
Yep, we can.
Excellent. I mean, I guess my point of view is that it's very clear what that Blair era measurement gave us is a really great example of how to create gaming, how to create all of those confusing incentives and encourage hitting the target, missing the point, or better playing the scoreboard, but not the game. There is one of the factors that we're not talking about is there's an ongoing battle between increased sophistication of understanding, as illustrated by this kind of conversation, and decreased capacity and capability as funding gets reduced, the amount of policy, the amount of analytical capability available in most of the organizations delivering this kind of change comes through. I mean, it is possible to have sophisticated measures that are really outcomes focused, that are much, much harder to game. It's less likely that people will be able to absorb and create and adapt those kind of measures for themselves. So I think it's fair to say that there's at least three options here. There is just being engaged in the complexity, working in trust, working in partnership and trying to achieve the outcomes. There's top-down directive, incentivized performance measurement. And there's something else which would be more sophisticated and more complex, but wouldn't solve either of those problems necessarily. I think that we need to look at the structural issues. What does funders, central government, those directing the change want and need to see, and how we're able to respond to that in terms of delivery? Because we often lose sight of the fact that there are multiple levels at play here. But ultimately, I think we need to understand that measures are a combination of what we're aiming for, how we understand the context, and therefore, as we saw in the principles right at the start of this, not only the measures, but also the purpose needs to be subject to revision as we learn about the complexity of our situation.
Yeah, thank you so much, Benjamin. I think that's a really important point, actually, particularly with the different levels of government, because I think often, spatial levels are important in this debate, and often the sort of collaborative processes that we've been hearing quite a lot about are really effective at the local level. But actually, from a sort of central government level, central government relies on a degree of abstraction to be able to make good decisions. Now, we could turn this into an argument about, or a discussion about devolution, and what's the right sort of spatial level for power to sit. And that's very different in all of the jurisdictions that we have represented here, so that's a different discussion, not necessarily one we should get into. But I think it's an important component to keep in mind, because it does acknowledge the fact that there's a bit of, to use a British expression, a bit of horses for courses here. And that's, Joe alluded earlier to the work of Anwar Ibrahim, who's speaking in the closing discussion to this conference. We do like that work because it does offer a framework that kind of acknowledges that certain approaches will work better in some places than in others. And it may feel like rather a cop-out, but actually it is really important, I think, for us to increase the understanding of which sort of approach to measurement and learning is appropriate for which sort of environment. And to some extent, I think this is, I don't know whether Lavinia or Carolina, you'd like to chip in on this, but I think there was a real contrast in the sort of approaches you were each talking about. Lavinia, you were sort of looking at the readiness for organizations to engage with outcomes-based funding, whereas Carolina, you were talking about organizations that prefer trust-based funding, and those can really feel quite different. So, it could just be worth picking up on what, is this just a question of the preferences of the funder in a particular area, or are there particular, I don't know, policy areas or geographical contexts where one approach is better than others? I don't know whether either of you or anyone else has any perspectives on that.
Yes, in my opinion, it is not so related to the funder itself. I mean, in this case, the idea for the local government is to be ready also, first of all, to change perspective and going from fee-for-service to outcome-based contracts. And of course, there are many variables that you could consider, and there is the issue of what are you going to measure, how are you going to measure. But for sure, let's say that you cannot do this kind of shift if you are dealing with organizations that are only, that they don't have any structure of data management. Then we can discuss what kind of data are you collecting, how are you also going to build a relationship based on trust. And for me, these are, of course, other elements that you have to put in the picture. But this kind of assessment was really thought with the idea of understanding the ecosystem in which we are going to work from different perspectives. I mean, now I focused mainly on the data issue, also because we also find out that, of course, 2/3 of the sample, they declare that they collect data, but then if you look deeper, most of them, they consider collecting data, doing focus group. So the social workers, of course, they keep track of what they are doing with focus group, but maybe the output of these meetings are documents on paper. So then there is the issue, how are you going to have this information if you are going to base the policy on outcomes, for instance. So this was actually something to understand where we are going to move. And also the issue of trust was present. So the idea was not to, from day 2, start to change the way in which the public funding is managed. But the idea is to do a kind of process with the organization, with the local organizations. And this is why the first year there was this first assessment. There were also many, I won't say teaching days, but there were seminars or moments in which they also met, for instance, us. But this policy has also other elements. So they are working with service design with the Polytech of Milan to help them to rethink welfare services delivered by social enterprises, but in partnership with the local government. And then they are also working on juridical issues. So this is, what I told you is a very small piece of a bigger policy that they are trying to implement, in which the issue of trust is present. I think you can't, it is not a matter of two different perspectives, but you have to find a way to match them.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, that there is that sort of focus on process and trust in there as well as the measurement part. Yeah, that's really useful. Carolina, did you want to just chip in on that?
So if we focus on outcomes only, I find that it forces organizations to work on.
Sorry, Carolina, I'm just going to interrupt you because there's some background noise coming from somewhere. Can those of you who have spoken just make sure you have remuted? Okay, I think we're good. We now can't hear you, Carolina. There we go.
And so sometimes focusing on the outcomes makes the organizations work at searching for grants and applying for what is available, and doing instead of doing what is really needed and what they think about because they are in the field and they know it. So instead of creating something important right now, right here, they focus on how they can survive. And also, you mentioned the process, which is also, I think, it is actually always a process. So, like, engaging in everyday, or not every day, but in a process of developing ideas and working in the field gives probably the founders the idea what exactly is done, or how the context is impacting, what is changing, and at the same time the trust is built between two parts, between the grantee and funder. And well, collecting the data and creating the knowledge is definitely a very important thing. Because I'm not sure what exactly do you mean, Lavinia, in your project about it, but I do agree that like gathering some knowledge about what is done is definitely crucial.
Thanks, Carolina. I think we've got most of that. The audio is not particularly good on your end, so maybe just have a look at that in case we want to come back to you again. I wanted to bring in Denise. Denise, you've been sharing some work that you've been doing in the chat. It would be great if you could come on and just tell us all a little bit more about that. It seemed to have a bit of a process of two-way learning going on there.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes, please do introduce yourself as well, Denise.
Yeah, so I'm Denise Costa. I'm a Senior Research and Evaluation Officer at the NSPCC. And we have several kind of place-based initiatives that work across communities and systems to try and prevent abuse in the areas where the place-based initiatives are focused. I think the key for our evaluation is to try and make the learning relevant for all the different stakeholders that are involved with the initiatives. So we basically have different strands to our evaluation. So we have a process evaluation which seeks to understand those kind of implementation issues, what's working well, what isn't working well, and then that feeds back really quickly in a kind of test and learn approach to think about development. We also have outcomes evaluation, where we have a theory of change which defines the outcomes that we're trying to achieve as an organization in collaboration with local areas. And for those, we have different types of measurement, but we have kind of survey measurement to look at changes in knowledge, attitudes, and behavior. But we're looking at that to measure change, but then we also use our baseline measures to feed back to professionals and communities about what we're hearing from them, to allow them to reflect on whether those reflects the reality of their experience, and help them to think about how they take that information to think about how we might develop interventions to address some of the gaps that are identified in that kind of knowledge, attitudes, and behaviour. We also have kind of bottom-up outcomes measurement, where we're using a kind of most significant transformative evaluation approach to understand what community members primarily are telling us is changing for them. And this kind of feeds back to our senior stakeholders and other partners to say, okay, this is what we think we are achieving with our initiatives in terms of the theory of change. We're trying to measure that, but how does that reflect what people are telling us is changing for them, really? So it's this idea of kind of iterative development of the evaluation, and also understanding how to make all of that learning relevant to support the design and development as in a kind of ongoing process, basically. So yeah, trying to cover lots of bases, I guess, really. But I think the key thing is that because there are so many different participants and partners involved in it, and there are so many different requirements from the kind of organizational perspective in terms of accountability for how we're spending our money, but also in terms of actually how are we using what people are telling us is changing to improve what we're doing as well.
Yeah, very interesting example. I think it points to the need to kind of invest in processes for information to flow between these many different stakeholders in a project or in a collaboration. But I also really like this idea of kind of involving the actual users of services, or citizens or residents or whoever it is for a particular collaboration, you know, in the process of measurement as well, and in sense checking perhaps what some of that more formal evaluation is saying, and making sure that it does accord with the sort of lived experience of people on the ground. And I think just, rather than making it an either or, sort of battle of approaches, finding ways to kind of bring those two things together so that they reinforce each other is really interesting. So it sounds like there's a lot of good practice to learn from you, Denise. You mentioned theory of change, and I actually wanted to bring this back to you, John, at CPI, because I know that you've been doing a lot of thinking on, I guess, models that can kind of support some of the approaches that we've been discussing. Theory of change is a model that's extremely popular. This idea that there's sort of linear causal chain that you can follow from inputs through to outputs and outcomes. But I think you've questioned the utility of that and perhaps explored a few alternatives. So it'd be nice to hear a little bit from you on that.
Yeah, sure. Happy to. So I think, a lot of people have raised points on why there might be flaws in the assumption that, the world works in a very predictable, linear way, particularly when we're dealing with problems of the complexity that we see in the public sector and communities. I think, personally, I'm someone who I feel like I was taught a certain way, and some of the professional experiences I've had prior to joining CPI, I was kind of given a particular worldview that, to make a difference, we need to be able to quantify the impact that we're going to have, and then invest in the interventions that are based on the evidence most likely to achieve the impact. And so I saw the pretty PowerPoint slide of the logic model, which is even more simple, I think, than the theory of change, that says invest in these inputs, leads to these evidence-based activities, you're going to have a predictable set of outputs, and that's going to lead to the outcomes that you want to see. And while this sounded like very convincing take on how impact could be achieved, in reality, when I started to get a little bit closer to the problems and work with some of the organizations in nonprofits in the US, and then city governments in the US as well, and local governments in the UK, started to see that the only thing you could really predict is that the unpredictable would happen, and that you don't necessarily know whether or not one thing is going to work in one context compared to another. So I think that personally just challenged my worldview and is making me think a little bit more about the fact that everyone is coming in with their own different mindsets and models of how the world works, and some are very, very helpful in understanding what a particular context looks like, but we just need to be mindful that an approach that works in one place may not necessarily work in another. And I think what we've been talking about in terms of like trust and relationships and openness, this is something that is just by very nature of the complexity of human beings going to be unique to the different communities that we're working in. So I don't think there's a silver bullet set of conditions or even values that are going to work in where I'm right now, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, and London or Australia, specific places across the world. I think it's really about being embedded within the community and understanding which conditions will lead to trusting relationships being able to flourish. So yeah, that's from what I've learned so far, but I'm also consistently learning that what I used to think was not quite right. So already, I think in this panel discussion, I've learned so much, but that's my quick take on that.
Great, yeah, thank you so much, John. I mean, I think what you're saying accords with what Tim said at the start, which is a sort of a boxing match. I can't remember exactly how you put it, Tim, but you had a very nice way of putting it.
A boxing match, more a boxing match than a balancing act, perhaps.
Yeah, I mean, there is, and that's, I think, what makes this an interesting discussion a lot of the time, is it can be a bit factional at times, because as you say, John, there are people coming into the room with very different worldviews or mental models. We had this a little bit even within the Go Lab, you know, and we're all geeks, but even so, you know, we don't all necessarily agree on exactly how the world works. And of course, you know, that plays out in collaborations in particular, when you've got sort of partnerships and multiple different stakeholders coming from different perspectives, different sectors and so on, you often find that particularly acutely. So yeah, getting around the table and taking the time to invest in that process of relationship building and trust building is really important. But you know, there is clearly, I think, what's coming out, a degree of informational infrastructure that needs to be put around that to make it really function well, which needs to kind of borrow from a lot of these different traditions, so that everyone around the table can kind of see something they recognize in a particular measurement approach. There is a way through this, and there's some great examples, I think, of that. Great. Well, we're almost at the end of the session. I'm going to turn it over to my colleague Claire Fitzgerald in just a moment to offer a few sort of some summaries of the discussion and closing thoughts. But before I do, I just wanted to maybe hand it back to either Dawn or Joe or both of you, just to sort of close the loop on the discussion and ask if either of you had any thoughts you wanted to share before I hand it over to Joe. Sorry, to Claire.
And nothing in particular, just to say, yeah, it's been a really rich conversation. I think we've really deepened our understanding and raised some more questions about those 7 principles Joe shared at the start. So yeah, really keen to perhaps explore a blog that builds on that and enables us to pose some new questions and shape the peer learning sessions that come next. One thing that we haven't had a chance to get into, which I think would be really interesting to explore further, is that point that someone raised about kind of trusting people closest to the issue and how we create measurement approaches that support them in that rather than hinder. But thanks everyone for a really great discussion.
Yeah, I was just going to echo that, and I think some of the important takeaways for me was the importance of kind of looking at how the data follows the intent. You know, so we can talk about this trust and collaboration, but we do need that sort of muscular and robust information follow-up and sharing, which seems to be a practical issue, if perhaps it's a little bit more than a practical issue. But yeah, no, a fantastic discussion. I think notched on certainly my thinking quite significantly. So thank you, everybody.
Yeah, there's been an awful lot of great discussion in the chat as well, which I haven't been able to keep track of as much as I would have liked to, given that I've been also chairing the live discussion. But there's a really, really rich set of reflections there as well, which we will definitely make sure to record. Great. Can I pass it over to you then, Claire, just to offer a few summarizing thoughts and maybe talk about some of the related sessions we've got later on in the conference?
Yeah, absolutely. I also, like everyone else who's just talked, thought that was a really stimulating conversation. And I think the things that really landed for me were around this kind of perennial tension that organizations face between servicing learning systems that help them improve, right, their own internal organizational working, and then systems that help them measure and account for things to externals. And that those are not always mutually reinforcing systems. Sometimes they're duplicative and sometimes they're actually antagonistic. And I think really being clear about whether or not it's possible to balance those well is an interesting avenue to potentially talk through in the future. Another thing that came out in the chat, and you know, I think it's important, is around being explicit about kind of at what level you're articulating a particular link between data and the kind of maybe processes and outcomes that flow across. So are you operating about a service? Are you talking about data to help improve an organization or a system? And it's not that there's a right or wrong answer, but that it's helpful to be explicit about what level you're trying to think through or brainstorm about, because so often we work at different levels, but it's not explicitly made. I think also the thing that came across for me was this need to really be contextually informed, but perhaps needing to do a bit more woodshedding around what that means. So what are we looking at in terms of context? and how do we begin to be contextually informed in our sort of design of processes as well as our ways of working. So those are the things that stood out to me. And then I think just before we wrap up this session, I basically have 3 big things I want to say to everybody. The first is that, as Dawn mentioned, on the back of this sessions and the roundtables before it, we are hereby launching a new peer learning group called the Motives for Measurement Roundtable. And this is jointly run by ourselves here at GoLab and Collaborate. And the idea is that this group is going to discuss many of the themes that we talked through today with a UK focus. And the idea here is that, as it is with most of our peer learning groups, this is a committed group with ongoing membership that will meet regularly online to hear examples of places that are using measurement in both smart and maybe not so smart ways, because we learn from failure, y'all. So, you know, to support really our learning and practice around accountability. So, you know, get your pens out. Our next meetings for this are scheduled for the 15th of October and the 26th of November. Again, that's the 15th of October and the 26th of November. And those will run from 10 a.m. to 11:30 a.m. British time. And if you want to join this group, you can do that 2 ways. You can email us at golab@bsg.ox.ac.uk or go to our website to find out more info and contact details. You can go to community and then to peer learning. So in my 3 things I was going to tell you, I'm on the second thing now. What I wanted to flag up is if this conversation today was something that you're keen to talk more about, and there are many stones left unturned, we are going to unturn some of those stones again at the conference. So tomorrow we have a big picture session entitled Impact Alchemy. And the idea here is that we're going to try to distill some of the differences that are inherent to our organizations and our professional perspectives when it comes to data collection and data use. So I anticipate that it will be a very convergent thinking kind of plenary. So, or excuse me, divergent, not convergent. So trying to set some expectations there. But again, if you like today, definitely join us tomorrow for that Impact Alchemy big picture session kicking off at 1 p.m. And then thirdly, finally, what's happening immediately next. From here, we're moving into breakout groups for some networking and further discussion. So if you want to join those, just stay on the line and accept moving into that breakout group when you get prompted. We will come back all together again at 1 p.m. today for a different big picture session, which is growing an ecosystem for outcomes-based partnerships. And as always, the login information for that session can be found in your online program. So to say it again, if you're wanting a screen break, you can drop out of the call now. We loved having you. Thank you so much for coming. If you're wanting to be in breakout rooms to talk a bit more informally and a bit more intimately, then you can just stay on the line. But either way, I would like to thank you for a great session and look forward to seeing you at 1 p.m. for our big picture growing an ecosystem for outcomes-based partnerships.